Jonathan Reynolds had everything a man could dream of: wealth, status, and a beautiful home. He was the owner of a successful business and lived a life of comfort with his wife, Claire. For years, Claire had been by his side, supporting him through his struggles and celebrating his victories. She was a kind-hearted woman who loved him deeply, believing that their marriage was built on trust and love. At first, Jonathan felt the same way. When they got married, he promised Claire a wonderful life, and he did his best to keep that promise. They traveled together, attended lavish parties, and enjoyed the luxuries that his business success provided. But as time passed, things changed. Jonathan became restless. The excitement in his marriage began to fade, and he started craving something new, something different. Then, one day, he met Vanessa. She was young, attractive, and full of energy. Unlike Claire, who had been with him through life's ups and downs, Vanessa was carefree and exciting. She made Jonathan feel young again, as if he had been given a second chance to relive his youth. Their conversations were filled with laughter, and every moment with her felt like an adventure. The more time he spent with Vanessa, the more he pulled away from Claire. Claire noticed the change in Jonathan. He became distant, coming home late and avoiding conversations. When she asked him what was wrong, he would brush it off, telling her he was just busy with work. But deep inside, she knew something was different. She felt the space growing between them, and it scared her. She tried everything: cooking his favorite meals, planning trips together, and reminding him of the love they once shared, but nothing seemed to bring him back. Then, one evening, Jonathan finally spoke the words that shattered Claire's world. He told her he wasn't happy anymore. He wanted something new, something fresh. He admitted that he had fallen in love with someone else and that he wanted a divorce. Claire's heart broke into a million pieces. She couldn't believe the man she had loved for so many years was willing to walk away so easily. Tears filled her eyes as she begged him to reconsider, reminding him of everything they had been through together. But Jonathan had already made up his mind. He didn't want to fight for their marriage. He wanted to be with Vanessa. Within weeks, their divorce was finalized, and Jonathan walked away without looking back. As Claire sat alone in their once happy home, she felt like her whole world had collapsed. She had lost not only her husband, but also the life they had built together. What she didn't know, however, was that life had something unexpected in store for her, something that would change everything. After Jonathan left, Claire felt lost, like her world had been turned upside down. The house that once felt warm and full of love now seemed empty and cold. She had given everything to her marriage, and in return, she was left with nothing but broken dreams. The pain of his betrayal weighed heavily on her heart. But Claire wasn't the type to give up easily. She wasn't going to let this setback define her life. A few weeks passed, and Claire tried her best to adjust to life on her own. She focused on her work, took long walks, and spent time with friends who supported her. But despite her efforts to stay strong, she couldn't shake the emptiness she felt inside. There were nights when she would sit in silence, staring at the spot where Jonathan once sat, feeling the absence of his presence in every corner of the house. Then, one day, Claire discovered something that would change everything. She wasn't feeling well, so she decided to visit the doctor. After a series of tests, the doctor delivered shocking news: she was pregnant. At first, Claire couldn't believe it. How could this be possible? Jonathan had left her months ago, and she hadn't even thought about having another child. But after a second visit to the doctor, the truth was undeniable. She was going to have a baby. Claire sat in her car after the appointment, overwhelmed with emotion. She felt a mix of surprise, fear, and excitement. She had always wanted children, but this wasn't how she imagined becoming a mother again. She hadn't planned for this, especially not in the midst of her heartache. But as the initial shock began to fade, a sense of determination filled her. She wasn't going to let this unexpected pregnancy scare her. Instead of feeling sorry for herself, Claire decided to embrace the situation. She would raise this child, no matter what it took. As her pregnancy progressed, she received more surprising news. She wasn't expecting one baby, but four. The ultrasound showed that she was going to have quadruplets. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe it. 4 babies. She had always imagined having a big family, but this was beyond her wildest dreams. Though it was overwhelming to think about raising 4 children at once, Claire knew she was up for the challenge. She had always been a strong and independent woman, and this would be no different. She didn't need Jonathan's help. She was capable of doing this on her own. Throughout her pregnancy, Claire found strength in the love and support of her friends and family. They helped her prepare for the arrival of the babies, throwing baby showers and offering their help when she needed it. Claire's heart swelled with gratitude. She knew that, despite the pain she had experienced, she wasn't alone in this journey. Finally, the day came when the quadruplets were born. 4 beautiful boys. Claire couldn't believe her eyes as she held each of them in her arms. Her heart was full, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She had created something beautiful out of the heartbreak she had endured. These 4 boys were her new beginning, her chance to start fresh and build a future filled with love. Jonathan had everything he thought he wanted. After leaving Claire, he started a new life with Vanessa, the young and beautiful woman who had captured his attention. At first, everything felt exciting. They traveled to luxurious places, attended glamorous parties, and enjoyed the kind of carefree life Jonathan thought he had been missing. He convinced himself that he had made the right decision, that leaving Claire was necessary for his own happiness. But as time went on, cracks began to form in his perfect new life. Vanessa, who had once seemed so charming and full of energy, started showing a different side. She was more interested in shopping and social events than in spending quality time with Jonathan. She loved the attention that came with dating a wealthy businessman, but she didn't seem to care about him the way Claire once had. Whenever he tried to have deep conversations with her, she would quickly lose interest or change the subject. Jonathan ignored these signs at first. He told himself that relationships changed over time and that things would improve, but deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The warmth, the deep connection, the sense of home, none of it was there with Vanessa. Instead, their relationship felt shallow, like it was built on nothing but luxury and fun. One evening, after a long day at work, Jonathan came home expecting to see Vanessa, but she wasn't there. He called her several times, but she didn't answer. Hours later, she finally returned, acting distant and uninterested. When Jonathan asked her where she had been, she simply shrugged and told him she had been out with friends. Her words felt cold, and for the first time, Jonathan felt a deep sense of regret. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them grew. Vanessa spent more and more time away, and Jonathan found himself alone in the expensive house they shared. The excitement that once filled his life had disappeared, replaced by an emptiness he couldn't ignore. Then, one day, Vanessa packed her bags and left without much explanation. She told him she wanted something different, something more exciting. The very same words he had once told Claire. Jonathan sat alone in his house, the silence almost unbearable. He had lost everything, his wife, his marriage, and now even Vanessa. For the first time, he truly felt the consequences of his choices. He had walked away from a woman who had loved him unconditionally, believing that happiness was somewhere else. But now he realized the truth. He had thrown away something real for an illusion. As he sat there, memories of Claire flooded his mind. He thought about the way she used to smile at him, the way she had always believed in him. He wondered how she was doing now. Did she ever think about him? Did she still hate him for what he had done? More than anything, he wondered if she had moved on. Little did he know, Claire's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. And soon, their paths would cross again in the most unexpected way. Jonathan had spent the last few years drowning in regret. His once glamorous life had lost its shine, and the loneliness weighed heavy on him. He often thought about Claire and wondered how her life had turned out. but he never tried to reach out, believing it was too late to fix the past. One evening, Jonathan attended a charity event hosted by a business associate. It was meant to be a simple gathering, filled with speeches and donations, but something unexpected happened. As he walked through the crowd, his eyes fell on a group of young men standing near the stage. There were 4 of them, tall, confident, and strangely familiar. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't explain why, but something about them caught his attention. He observed them closely, their facial features, the way they smiled, even their expressions. Everything reminded him of himself when he was younger. It was as if he were looking at a reflection of his own past. Confused and intrigued, he moved closer, listening to their conversation. When one of them laughed, the sound sent a chill down his spine. It was too familiar. It sounded just like his own laugh. Curiosity got the better of him. He approached the young men, introducing himself casually. They greeted him politely, their expressions friendly but guarded. Jonathan asked their names, and when they introduced themselves, his heart nearly stopped. Their last name was Reynolds, his last name. A wave of shock washed over him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Could it be possible? Were these young men connected to him in some way? The thought seemed unbelievable, yet deep down, something told him that he already knew the answer. With his hands slightly trembling, Jonathan hesitated before asking, "Who is your mother?" One of the boys looked at him curiously before responding, "Claire Reynolds." Jonathan felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. Claire, his Claire, the woman he had abandoned years ago. His breath caught in his throat as realization hit him like a thunderbolt. These weren't just random young men. They were his sons. His mind flooded with emotions, shock, disbelief, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of loss. How had this happened? How had he gone so many years without knowing he had children? And not just one, but 4. The quadruplets, unaware of his internal struggle, continued talking, but Jonathan barely heard them. His world had changed in an instant. He looked at them again, truly seeing them this time. The shape of their noses, the way their eyes crinkled when they smiled, the strong jawlines. There was no doubt. They were his. Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to say something, to ask a million questions, but his voice failed him. His past had finally caught up to him in a way he never expected. And now he had to face the truth. He had abandoned not just his wife, but his own children. Jonathan stood frozen in place, his mind struggling to process what he had just learned. The 4 young men in front of him, strong, confident, and full of life, were his sons. A mixture of emotions swirled inside him, shock, regret, and a deep sadness that he couldn't put into words. For years, he had believed he had moved on from his past. But now, that past was standing right in front of him. He wanted to speak, to ask them questions, but his mouth felt dry. Before he could say anything, one of the young men asked, "Do you know our mother?" The question hit him like a wave. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "Yes," he said softly. "I knew Claire a long time ago." His voice barely came out, and the words felt heavier than he expected. The boys exchanged glances. They were polite, but Jonathan could sense the distance in their tone. They didn't know who he was. They had no idea that he was their father. His heart pounded. He knew what he had to do. He needed to see Claire. He needed answers. Without wasting any more time, he asked, "Where is your mother now?" One of the boys crossed his arms. "She's doing well. She built her own business, raised us on her own, and made sure we never needed anyone else." His words were simple, but Jonathan could hear the pride in his voice. Claire had done everything without him. Jonathan nodded, feeling a deep sense of guilt. He had left Claire when she needed him the most, and now he was standing here, realizing just how much he had gone through alone. He took a deep breath and made a decision. He had to see her. Later that evening, Jonathan found himself outside Claire's office building. He hesitated before walking in, his heart racing. When he finally saw her, he almost couldn't believe his eyes. Claire looked different, stronger, more confident, and even more beautiful than he remembered. She wasn't the broken woman he had left behind. She had rebuilt herself. Claire looked up and froze when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she let out a deep breath and folded her arms. "Jonathan," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard. "I met them, Claire," he admitted. "Our sons." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "And now you're here. Why?" Jonathan struggled to find the right words. I didn't know. If I had." Claire cut him off. "But you didn't. You've never cared to find out." Her words were sharp, but there was no anger, only truth. Jonathan felt a lump in his throat. He had made a terrible mistake, and now he didn't know if he could ever fix it. But one thing was clear. He had lost something far greater than he had ever realized. Jonathan stood in front of Claire, feeling smaller than he ever had before. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, and for the first time, he truly understood just how much damage he had done. Claire, however, looked strong. She wasn't the heartbroken woman he had left behind all those years ago. She was confident, successful, and completely in control of her life. Looking at her now, Jonathan realized something. She had never needed him. She had raised 4 children, built a business, and created a life full of love and happiness without him. He took a deep breath. "Claire, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice quieter than before. "But I had no idea. I didn't know about them." Claire studied him for a long moment. "And whose fault is that, Jonathan?" she asked. "You walked away without looking back. Did you ever wonder how I was doing? Did you ever think to check on me?" Jonathan swallowed hard. He had no excuse. He had been too busy chasing an illusion of happiness, believing that leaving Claire would make his life better. But instead of finding happiness, he had ended up alone. And now, standing in front of the woman he had abandoned, he realized that she had built a life far richer than anything he had ever known. "I regret everything," he admitted, his voice filled with guilt. "I was selfish. I thought I was chasing happiness, but all I did was throw away the best thing I ever had." Claire shook her head, her expression calm but firm. "Jonathan, regret doesn't change the past. I raised my sons without you. I held them when they cried. I worked hard to give them a future, and I made sure they never felt like they were missing anything." She sighed. "You don't get to just walk back into our lives because you suddenly feel guilty." Jonathan felt a painful lump in his throat. He had hoped for some chance at redemption, but he could see that Claire wasn't going to let him in so easily. "I don't expect anything from you," he said finally. I want to know them, if they'll let me." Claire hesitated. He could see the conflict in her eyes. After a moment, she let out a deep breath. "That's not my decision to make. They're grown now. If they want to meet you, that's up to them." Jonathan nodded. It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but it was more than he deserved. "Thank you," he said softly. Claire gave him one last look before turning away. "But don't expect them to welcome you with open arms, Jonathan. They know who was there for them, and who wasn't." As she walked away, Jonathan felt the full weight of his choices settle on his shoulders. He had lost so much, and now he could only hope that his sons would give him a chance to make things right. Jonathan spent the next few days thinking about everything Claire had said. She was right. He couldn't just walk back into his sons' lives and expect them to accept him. He had been absent their whole lives, and no amount of regret could change that. Still, he couldn't ignore the deep desire in his heart to know them. After much thought, he decided to take things slow. He didn't want to force himself into their lives. Instead, he started attending events where they were involved. He learned that 2 of them were running a startup company, while the other 2 were pursuing careers in medicine and engineering. Seeing them succeed made Jonathan both proud and ashamed. proud that they had grown into such incredible men, but ashamed that he had played no role in their success. One day, he gathered the courage to approach them again. He found them at a business seminar and waited for the right moment. When they finally noticed him, there was a brief silence before one of them spoke. "You again?" His tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. Jonathan nodded. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I just want to talk, if you'll let me." The four brothers exchanged glances, silently communicating with each other. Finally, one of them, Daniel, sighed and said, "Fine, we'll listen." Jonathan took a deep breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to accept me. But I need you to know that I regret everything. If I had known about you, I would have never left." He paused before adding, "But that's not an excuse. I should have been there for your mother. I should have been there for you." The brothers listened, their expressions unreadable. After a moment, another one, Michael, spoke. "Why now?" he asked. "Why do you care now, after all these years?" Jonathan's throat tightened. "Because meeting you made me realize what I lost. I spent years chasing happiness in the wrong places, and I didn't see that the real treasure was the family I abandoned." He looked at each of them. "I can't change the past, but if there's any chance that I can be in your lives, even in the smallest way, I would be grateful." The silence that followed was heavy. Jonathan held his breath, not knowing what to expect. Then finally, Daniel spoke again. "We need time to think about this." Jonathan nodded, accepting their words. "I understand. Take all the time you need." As they walked away, Jonathan felt a mix of emotions: hope, fear, and uncertainty. He had taken the first step, but he knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. His sons had grown up without him, and earning their trust would take more than just words. But for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: a chance to make things right. Days passed, and Jonathan didn't hear from his sons. He didn't want to push them, so he waited, hoping they would reach out when they were ready. But the silence was difficult. Every day, he wondered if he had lost his last chance to be in their lives. Then, one evening, his phone rang. When he saw an unknown number on the screen, his heart pounded. He quickly answered. "Hello." There was a pause before a familiar voice spoke. "It's Daniel." Jonathan sat up straight. "Daniel, I'm glad you called." "We talked," Daniel said. "Me, Michael, Ryan, and Jason. We're not sure how we feel about all this, but we agreed to meet you for dinner, just to talk." Jonathan felt a surge of relief. "That means a lot. Thank you." "We're not promising anything," Daniel warned. "This is just a meeting." "I understand," Jonathan said quickly. "I'll be there." That weekend, they met at a quiet restaurant. Jonathan arrived early, nervous but hopeful. When his sons walked in, he felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. They were strong, confident, and successful, everything a father could hope for in his children. Yet he had played no role in shaping them. As they sat down, the conversation started awkwardly. The brothers asked him about his life, his career, and why he had never looked for them before. Jonathan answered honestly, admitting his mistakes and expressing his regrets. He didn't try to make excuses, he just wanted them to know the truth. Slowly, the tension eased. The brothers began sharing small details about their childhood. How Claire had worked tirelessly to give them a good life, how they had supported each other growing up, how they had learned to be strong from their mother's example. Jonathan listened, realizing just how much Claire had done for them. At one point, Michael asked, "Do you regret leaving Mom?" Jonathan looked down, his heart heavy. "Every single day," he admitted. "She was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too blind to see it. I made the biggest mistake of my life when I walked away." The brothers exchanged glances, their expressions softening just a little. By the end of the dinner, the atmosphere had changed. There were no promises, no sudden declarations of forgiveness, but something important had happened. A bridge had been built. As they got up to leave, Ryan hesitated before saying, "We're not ready to call you Dad. We don't know if we ever will. But maybe we can get to know you." Jonathan's eyes filled with emotion. "That's more than I could have hoped for." As they walked out, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He had lost so much time, but now he had a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it.